situation in which judges are made to routinely fear for their safety is one that has substantially departed from the norms of a democratic system. This is a quote from Supreme Court Justice Jackson. The executive branch under the Trump administration has challenged democratic norms on many fronts. It puts the judiciary's credibility under doubt and thus tests the resilience both of rule of law and the separation of powers.
Meanwhile, the EU feels, quote, let down by its oldest ally, as countries across the globe are increasingly questioning the state of American democracy and its reliability as the political and economic anchor of the West. Joining us to hopefully shed some light on these issues today is Kim Wehle, tenured law professor currently visiting Leiden University, expert on the American Constitution and author of numerous books, including How to Read the Constitution and Why. So without further ado, I'm Einar.
And I'm Geraldine.
And let's give a warm welcome to Kim Wehle.
Please take a seat.
Thank you.
So welcome, Ms. Wehle, to our couches. Diving right in. Last year, you published a book on the presidential pardon power, and you encouraged the broader public to engage with the Constitution and legal concepts. Why is writing to that audience so important?
Well, I started when Donald Trump first took office with a public-facing role around civic education, because it's lacking in the United States. So at the time, in 2015, there's a yearly survey out of the University of Pennsylvania. In 2015, 2/3 of Americans could not name the three primary branches of the federal government, legislative, judicial, and executive. And there was another survey that found that 10% of college graduates thought the television star Judge Judy was on the United States Supreme Court. The good news is, in the last 9 years, that's flipped. I don't know about Judge Judy, but now 2/3 of Americans can name the three branches of government. But if you don't understand how something works, you can't fix it. I mean, if from your iPhone to your car to your government. And so the idea behind these books is to not just describe the law and how it functions, but give people tools to be able to problem solve and analyze what's happening on their own. So that's what they're designed. So all my books have the and why: how to read the Constitution and why, what you need to do about voting and why, how to think like a lawyer and why, pardon power, how the pardon system works and why. Because as a law professor in the US, we do a lot of engagement in class. I know it's not the case in the Netherlands, but a lot of question and answer. And what I tell my students, if you understand the why do we have it this way, the what is much more readily available to people.
Mm-hmm. And getting into something which is, of course, of immense importance and which you write a lot about, the American Constitution. In your book, How to Read the Constitution and Why, you say that reading this document is sometimes like interpreting a poem a little bit. So while these broad principles do allow for some kind of endurance of the document, their flexibility could also be seen as a drawback in many instances. So what do you think are the disadvantages of this adaptability, and how can we observe those at the moment?
So it's very hard to officially amend the United States Constitution. There have been over 11,000 proposed amendments since it was ratified in 1788, and 27 actually made it through, because it requires supermajorities, 60% of both the federal legislatures and the state legislatures. And so as a result, the play in the joints, when a new question comes up under the Constitution, it goes to the Supreme Court, which is appointed for life by the president, not elected. And the downside, I think, is the Supreme Court effectively can amend the Constitution, and has done so dramatically in the last few years,
right,
with no buy-in from a majority of the populace. So the last 4 justices were put on the court with bare majorities, 50%, 50.1 or something, whereas like Ruth Bader Ginsburg, a liberal icon, almost 100% of Senate support. And so we've got a Supreme Court now that is making sweeping rulings that basically is like editing the Constitution without electoral buy-in. And I think that is inherently anti-democratic, and it's a problem.
What are some instances where we have seen that in recent years?
Well, I think the biggest one is the most important one for this moment in American democracy is last summer's decision in Trump versus United States, where the Supreme Court manufactured criminal immunity for presidents. That is, if presidents commit crimes in their official capacity as president, there's no legal accountability, even after they leave office. They're immune from any prosecution. That has essentially changed the incentives in the White House. You know, if you know you're never going to get a ticket for speeding, you'll speed. And so we're seeing a lot of speeding through stop signs and red lights, and so that's dramatic. But in terms of your specific question, the ruling, in my view, and others, constitutional court watchers and scholars, is that it amended a significant part of the Constitution. Well, 2 parts. One is Article 2, which is what gives the president the power, his powers, her powers, hopefully one day, says that he shall take care that the laws are faithfully executed, faithfully executed. I would argue that faithful execution of the laws does not include committing crimes. And the majority, Chief Justice Roberts, did not even didn't even talk about the take care clause. There's also in Article 1, in the impeachment clause in Article 1, which gives Congress the impeachment power, it makes clear, and I'm paraphrasing, that after an impeachment, the person impeached can still be prosecuted. Mm-hmm. You can be impeached for high crimes and misdemeanors. So that also would suggest that there is no immunity unless you take the absurd position that you can only be impeached for conduct that has nothing to do with being president, which that doesn't make any sense, right? You're only impeached for your private action. No, you're impeached for abusing the public trust. So that's an example, I think, where the court, under the guise of interpretation, made a dramatic restructuring of the Constitution. There are other reasons why we are where we are in the United States right now. It's not just the Supreme Court's fault. But that, I think the history books will underscore that decision as a pivotal moment in American history.
Yeah. Another pivotal moment maybe was the Capitol storming, one could say. And former Vice President Mike Pence said he was disappointed by Trump's use of the pardon power for people who stormed the Capitol and used violence against law enforcement officers. But why does the pardon power exist when it arguably goes against the principle that no one is above the law, arguably maybe like the immunity?
Well, the pardon power exists, I think, in every country except for China. So it goes back to an idea of mercy, that the criminal justice system, at least in England, which our constitution is based on common law England, the criminal justice system was not well established. At the time of the ratification of the Constitution, we didn't have 4th, 5th, 6th Amendments, these criminal defense protections. And so the sovereign would come in and pardon, in theory, people who slip through the cracks. It also was used for political reasons. The very first pardon in the United States was by George Washington for the people who participated in the Whiskey Rebellion. So the idea is, okay, we need to move people through, move the country on, past some kind of trauma. I argue in the book that the pardon power is limited. It's been limited by the Supreme Court. But in that immunity decision last summer, I think the court made clear that pardons are above the law as well. But you make an excellent point in that it is a vestige of an unlimited monarchy where, there aren't really limits on the king unless the king decides to waive their sovereign immunity. I'm the sovereign, my power, the divine right of kings comes from the divine, from God, so I can do no wrong unless I allow myself to be accountable. And you could make an argument that that's what's happened legally to the American Constitution, and we're seeing what kind of incentives that creates for certain kind of behavior in the White House.
And you already elucidated the Supreme Court giving away some responsibility with its decision, but the US system also is supposed to rest on a balance of power where in reality, the Congress has steadily handed over its authority to the presidency. And with Trump dominating the political stage and the judiciary struggling to impose limits or unwilling to impose limits in some cases, has Congress slowly been abdicating its constitutional responsibility?
Yes, Congress is out to pasture, out to lunch, not functioning right now. There's been a steady handoff of power for decades. The power to declare war is one example, and the president's power comparatively has been enhanced. The framers of the Constitution were worried about Congress. Congress has many more articles and specifics on congressional power than the president. But there are a few things that have happened since January 20th. They're significant. Congress has the power of the purse, meaning Congress decides how the executive branch spends money. And the president is cannot make a different decision. If money's appropriated, it must be spent, and it can't be moved around. That's under the Constitution and under a statute. You've probably heard of a guy by the name of Elon Musk, who came in and shut down agencies, fired people. That is inconsistent with congressional power of the purse, but Congress is doing nothing. So that's, if you're not going to enforce your power, it's gone. Another big one, you might have heard about a $400 million plane that is being gifted from Qatar to Donald Trump for use as an official airplane, but then would go to his library and he'd be able to keep it. That we have 2 emoluments clauses, meaning specifically the Constitution bans the receipt of gifts from a foreign power. And actually, if you're a federal employee, you're not even supposed to let someone buy you lunch. So at the lower levels of the government, it's quite clear that these kinds of conflicts of interest are not acceptable. But when it comes to the 2 powerhouses, the president and the Supreme Court, you might have also heard about Supreme Court justices taking gifts. The law isn't in place. And there are many other instances, I think, of how the Congress has just allowed the president to do whatever the president wants and not push back. We had 3 failed impeachments, Bill Clinton, 2 for Donald Trump. I think the framers thought impeachment was going to be a real disincentive. I might get fired through impeachment. I think we can take out our magic marker and cross that out. I don't think any president's worrying about impeachment anymore because it was so politicized. So we can go through how Congress is designed to check the presidency, and it's just not happening anymore. So.
Yeah. So as we established, there's been this continual kind of overreach of the presidency as compared to the Congress, but there's also this heightening of intensity of these challenges from the Trump administration. In your view, how much of what we're seeing right now is due to this long-term trend, and how much is a very dictated and active undermining of the legal system by this administration?
Well, it's a perfect storm. Yeah. I think it's probably both. The Supreme Court, in addition to this immunity decision last summer, in a series of cases, starting in the early 2000s, has dismantled big portions of the Voting Rights Act. So we fought a civil war around slavery. 13, 14, 15 amendments were passed after the Civil War to bring formerly enslaved people into the Union. Southern states primarily started passing ridiculous laws to keep people from the ballot box, including, recite the Constitution or, when many enslaved people were banned from learning how to read. One state had a law count the numbers of bubbles in a bar of soap to be able to read, right? To be able to vote. So Congress, with the help of Martin Luther King Jr. And Lyndon B. Johnson, signed this landmark legislation, the Voting Rights Act, in the 1960s, 1965. And the Supreme Court has steadily taken chunks out of that in significant ways. And so the answer to your question is, in this, not just because of Donald Trump, but we're in a world where politicians pick their voters and not voters picking their politicians, and where individual voters are not really influencing politicians at the federal level. It's corporations and billionaires, because the Supreme Court held in a landmark case called Citizens United that corporations are like people with birth certificates and they have First Amendment rights. Right. So if you've got a lot of money, which is billionaires or corporations, you can flood the airwaves with speech to get somebody elected. And super majorities of Americans want abortion rights. They want gun control. I mean, that's not happened. So I think those two examples just demonstrate we're not really in an environment for quite a while where the will of the people is translating into federal policy. And then you couple that with, under Bill Clinton, the North American Free Trade Agreement, a lot of the jobs in the 90s went abroad, and with just automation, that a lot of the sort of labor, blue-collar jobs just aren't available anymore. The standard of living has gone down in the United States. People struggle for basics. We don't have a very strong safety net. And there's a lot of disillusionment with government per se, that the old traditional system, elect a Democrat, it's just not helping life is getting harder and harder. And then Donald Trump comes in and says, listen, give me the power. Just give me the magic wand and I'll wave it. I'll just demolish the institutions and you follow me and I'll fix it. And I think there is probably some rational basis for a lot of people voting for that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, surely. And I think you mentioned here that the guardrails of the system of balance of powers seems to be quite significantly failing now in the case of where a president is not following orders from the Supreme Court or Congress. I think a natural thought in this situation is that were the founding fathers not slightly naive about the possibility of this happening? I mean, I guess another way to phrase it is, are the checks and balances inherently flawed, or are they just failing?
Well, that's, I guess, what came first, the chicken or the egg? I don't know. James Madison in the Federalist Papers, that ambition needs to be made to counteract ambition, right? That you can't just hope to elect good people. He wrote, if men were angels, we wouldn't need government. We wouldn't need structures. It's, if you've had a job, there are going to be rules of the game for your job, right? You have to check in at a certain time, check out. We have to have accountability for people. That being said, it was, we're a young country, and at the time of ratification of the Constitution, only 10% of the population could vote, which was wealthy men, and they all knew each other. So I think there was also an expectation that, and there's some evidence of this in the historical record, this expectation that only people of integrity would get to the point of having this kind of power. And they certainly didn't anticipate the size of the United States. They were concerned about lies, propaganda spreading faster than facts, which is why we have a republic and not a direct democracy, which is what we had under the Articles of Confederation. So lots of things have changed, but I would say it's a little bit of both. Benjamin Franklin said it's a republic if you can keep it. John Adams wrote his wife Abigail that he anticipated, because we have two parties. They're not in the Constitution, but we only have two parties, that America would die through self-suicide, he wrote, because ultimately the polarization would rupture the entire government. So I don't know. I don't know. We're in a moment, I think, where it'll never be the same again from where it was on January 19th.
As you say, we are in a probably pivotal moment right now, and to get more specific on what's happening right now, I think perhaps the biggest legal story to have come out of the US in the last few months is that of Abrego Garcia, so a citizen of El Salvador who was wrongfully deported by the Trump administration. And the Supreme Court has challenged or ordered the presidency to facilitate his return, which they have so far refused to do. And we were wondering, what does it mean for the separation of powers when the executive branch so openly defies a ruling from the highest court in the land?
It means that we have too much power concentrated in one person, in one branch. Before that decision, the sense I got was that people would say two things are going to fit. We're not to the point of a constitutional crisis until there's a Supreme Court ruling that's not respected. And then the second is we have to see what happens in the midterms. It's not just Abrego Garcia has gotten a lot of the press, but there are hundreds of people. Kristi Noem, Secretary of Homeland Security, was testifying this week in Congress, and there was a member who asked on behalf of a constituent who's a mother of one of the people that were deported. And the question for her, to Kristi Noem, was, can you tell me, so I can tell this mother, if her son is alive? Because there's no contact, there's no lawyers, there's nothing. And the answer was, you've got to ask Wehle, the president of El Salvador. We're out. That's when you get to the point where, due process, we have two due process clauses in the Constitution, the Fifth Amendment and the 14th. Fifth governs the federal government. It means you get notice that you did something wrong, and you have an opportunity to present your case, give some evidence, say it wasn't me, the tattoo doesn't make me a terrorist, whatever it is. When that's gone, I think we're in very, very treacherous waters when it comes to individual liberties. So that it's just hard to get around that. And the Supreme Court did say, facilitate, but this is also, I've been picking on the Supreme Court. The lower federal court said you must facilitate and effectuate. Effectuate meaning bring them back. The Supreme Court said, nope, you can't direct Donald Trump to effectuate the return, just facilitate the return. So that gives a lot of legal wiggle room. We put Wehle in the White House. We had that famous meeting. They both said, Wehle said, listen, it's up to Trump. Trump said, listen, it's up to him. Checkmate. You could make the argument that's facilitating. Yeah. So this is it's a hand-in-hand problem, I think, where we've got concentration of far-right politicians essentially dominating all three branches of government.
Yeah. And how does the suspension of habeas corpus relate to this? Because that's also something we've been reading a lot in the news.
So, Stephen Miller, close White House aide, has mentioned that. So one thing the Supreme Court did say, in another case involving these deportations, is that if you want to challenge your deportation, you have to do it through a habeas petition. Now, what is habeas? This also dates back to the Magna Carta, like due process. The idea is, it means in Latin, I think, to be of the body. It's about challenging your actual detention, that you're being held in prison. It's a civil action, so it's not like you're challenging your criminal conviction. You get to sue separately to get out of jail. And so Stephen Miller's indicated that the president is considering suspending habeas corpus. The Constitution allows the suspension of habeas corpus. Most scholars interpret that to mean only Congress can do that. But it would be outmaneuvering even that route for the people in El Salvador or wherever else people are going to be sent to. The Supreme Court said you could challenge your confinement through habeas, and the president successfully suspends habeas, then there's no challenge to confinement. But in a weird way, I mean, if you don't know where these people are, you can't communicate with them, they can't hire a lawyer, and even if they did hire a lawyer, they're going to have to go through the El Salvadoran government that's getting paid $6 million a year by the U.S. government to hold these folks. I think it's more scary than actually on the ground going to have any impact, because these people already don't have any rights.
Yeah, and you already touched upon the importance of enforcement, and if we have something like this, a defiance to comply with a ruling, if the Supreme Court wanted to confront Trump head on, what tools would it really have to make him comply?
Right. So who issues the tickets for speeding? It's the police officer, right? Otherwise you speed, and you can enforce it. You have to pay money. If you don't pay money, it gets doubled. Eventually they might impound your car. I mean, all the things. The federal judiciary enforces its orders through the U.S. Marshal Service. The U.S. Marshal Service's answers to Donald Trump. So again, so much power is being filtered to one place, and if you're in that position and you don't respect the rule of law, there is no rule of law. So I think to your earlier question, what we're also demonstrating is how much of American law, anyway, and the American Constitution, is an agreement to abide by the rule of law, right? It's just kind of what we call a norm, or just a social standard that we believe in the benefits of having rules that are enforced. And that's why I started writing these books, is because I think there's a significant portion of the American populace that thinks you could have a fascist dictator in the White House and still have all these liberties. There's not an understanding that liberties are directly tied to accountability for people who have power, right? So this is where I think the Supreme Court got it wrong in the immunity decision, and saying, oh, well, so long as he uses his official power, he's immune. That's the scary stuff, right? I mean, if I put zip ties on your wrists and throw you in the back of my car, that's a kidnapping, and I'll go to prison. But if I'm a police officer, you go to prison until you prove that you should get out of prison. So the government has these tremendous powers that regular people don't have, which means they should be more accountable, not less accountable. And it's that basic disconnect that I think people don't understand. Rights for me, but not for thee is completely fine. And we're seeing, and we'll see, if I don't know if Americans will at some point shift and realize that we're all in this together. But that's why I've been doing the work I do.
Yeah. And going maybe in one aspect of Trump using this power, recently he has issued executive orders publicly threatening law firms he sees as hostile, such as Perkins Coie, and they are, for example, barring federal employees from engaging with their attorneys. This has been labeled an unconstitutional retaliation by district judges. Given your background, you probably know some affected people personally. What does this targeting mean for them and the political climate more broadly?
This, I think, was something that none of us anticipated leading up to Trump's election and the confirmation of Kash Patel as an FBI director who has an enemies list going into the administration. There's discussions among lawyers, well, okay, what happens if they use the Justice Department against their political enemies, which was what was promised. And the response was, well, there's so many good lawyers, they're excellent lawyers that will come to these people's rescue, will get in front of a judge, the judge will dismiss vindictive prosecutions, will hold the Trump administration accountable. So what this has done, and I think Hillary Clinton was represented maybe by Perkins Coie, so by identifying firms and saying, we will basically cause such financial harm to you by withdrawing your security clearances. So all your lawyers who do work with the federal government that requires a clearance, you're going to lose all your work. We're not going to let you in buildings anymore. We're going to cancel all your federal contracts. What that has done is it's really a Sixth Amendment right to counsel problem, because it's made it harder for people who need representation to get representation. Now, some of us believe that the law firms that caved did so in a manner that's inconsistent with their obligation as members of the bar to uphold the rule of law, but they were really worried about their bottom line. I mean, these law firms, some of these lawyers make $10 to $20 million a year. And so they're big money. There's big money on the table. There's also, of course, a First Amendment. I know we haven't talked about, but there's a First Amendment challenge, and there's at least one judge has upheld the challenge to these orders targeting law firms. But in addition to due process, the First Amendment stuff is really problematic, going after universities, going after students, going after law firms, purging people, government employees based on speech relating to diversity, equity, inclusion, climate, gender, things like that.
Mm-hmm.
I think now is an appropriate time to open up the discussion for some questions from the audience. So if you have any questions, just raise your hand. We have a gentleman in the gray jacket here.
Well, I was very worried about Ukraine. Mr. Musk allowed Ukraine to use the satellite information. Thanks to that, Ukraine is still fighting. It could have been the other way. Is it not much more worrying that this is in the hands of a private person?
Yeah, so if I understand the question, it gets to a core issue of the separation of powers as well, which is how can someone who was not appointed, did not go through Senate confirmation, and actually isn't even part of a real agency. I mean, DOJ is not an agency. Congress creates agencies. There's no law creating DOJ. And he's not even a private party. I mean, excuse me, a governmental employee. But he was, courts move slowly. And so whether, these lawsuits were filed and they're percolating in the courts, meanwhile, all the damage is being done. So even if tomorrow we were to wake up and have a completely different White House, different president, we wake up from the dream and Kamala Harris takes over tomorrow, I don't know, or somebody. There's so much damage that's been done so it's kind of ask for forgiveness, not permission. I mean, he went in and did what he did, and he also took a lot of private information, American taxpayer information, which is deeply, deeply concerning. So if any of us, including myself, got a tax refund directly deposited into a bank account, now people have that information. So there's violations of the Privacy Act, other statutes. The judges don't even really know what happened and what's going on. So it's all happening in plain sight, and now the question is, he's apparently going to leave, but as I said, there's so much damage that's already been done, and just bypassing Senate confirmation, nobody stopped him. So that's now the new precedent moving forward, I think.
I think we have time for more questions.
Maybe the lady.
Maybe the lady in the front.
Lou?
Oh, okay. Hey, Kim. Thanks for being here. So you already said that there were two moments that people were looking forward to as maybe this is a breaking point, listening to the Supreme Court, and then the midterms. So when we talk about voters, that's a group that could potentially do something. But I haven't heard a lot of people talking about what the states can do. So we've heard that Trump is in a row with the governor of Maine, but could you maybe reflect on what can states still do? Do you think that there could be any energy or counterweight happening from there?
Yeah, great question. Now the states, so if you think about who has the enforcement power, of course, which is the power of law enforcement and ultimately the US military. That's the biggest bully on the block. It just is. States have access to state militias. I mean, God forbid that would ever become an issue. So there is some law enforcement apparatus at the state level, but the idea behind federalism, states versus a federal government, is less that the states will check the federal government, because we also have a supremacy clause that says federal law is supreme when there's a conflict. It's more about the dispersing power in different places, that again, it won't get accumulated one place. So we'll have parts of the country where there will be pushback, and parts of the country there won't. Parts of the country, and it's already the case, where you can have access to reproductive health, abortion, and other parts of the country you don't. There's a woman now, I read, in Georgia who is brain damaged, and turns out she's 9 weeks pregnant, and the government is keeping her on life support against the wishes of her family to finish the pregnancy, even though the fetus has some brain damage as well. So that's an extraordinary violation of someone's dignity, humanity, basic rights, because she didn't consent to this. That's already happening in the United States, where there's the haves and the have-nots. And so as far as pushback, if, as Steve Bannon said recently in an NPR interview with Steve Inskeep, and I'm paraphrasing, the constitutional violations are going to be, we're going to see more of them, not fewer of them. There will be some states that push back, and of course there are very, very red states that are in lockstep with this agenda, which was laid out to a large degree in the Project 2025 document.
Yeah, I think we have time for one more question. Gentleman in the green sweater.
The impunity for Trump, as it would be new, it confuses me. Colin Powell lied to the whole world in the Security Council of the United Nations about Iraq having weapons of mass destruction, showing an aerial photo of a factory in the Netherlands, in Almelo. So I'm confused. He said he had lied been to him by his senior military, but it also seemed to be not possible to put him in jail because he was in function. So was there already impunity for Colin Powell in those days? Thank you.
Yeah, so there has long been immunity for individuals doing their jobs in government. Meaning, so if you're a government employee and you're doing your job, someone can't sue you out of your pocket. Police officers, sometimes, but there's this standard of qualified immunity. It's very, very hard to go after them independently. I'm not sure in that instance if there would be a crime, right, around lying, whether he knew it or not. But certainly there was a long-standing expectation and standards that you wouldn't be liable personally for exercising judgment in your capacity as a government employee. Now, if you literally committed a crime, that's different. Government employees don't have immunity from committing a crime, which gets to the pardon power. I mean, if you now as president can commit crimes, and you're willing to use the pardon power to pardon people within your chain of command to execute those crimes for you, now you've got immunity for anybody because you can just pardon them. Federal judges get immunity for decisions made in their capacity as judges. Congress expressly has immunity in the Constitution. This is another reason why people are critical of the immunity ruling last summer, is because the framers of the Constitution did not give the president immunity, but did give Congress. So the framers knew how to give immunity if they wanted to give immunity, and they didn't. But I want to say one other point, though. You raised a great point about that time in history, which is the 9/11, the Iraq War. That was a moment where there was a real uptick in presidential power. The theory was that when we were at war, a war on terror, and you might remember the famous torture memos that came out of the Department of Justice, where the position of the Bush administration was that when the president's acting as commander-in-chief in a war, there's effectively immunity. That's known as the unitary executive theory, this idea that the president has unilateral authority over everyone in the executive branch, almost like a king. That theory is now being used to legally support the kind of power that is being exercised in the White House. I would argue it's inconsistent with the three branches, right? We don't have one branch, we have three branches. But that theory, I think, started prominently in the Bush administration. 9/11 was another pivotal moment in American history and American law, and American society was never the same after that day.
Okay, thank you very much for your great audience questions. We wanted to move forward with the discussion from the specific cases of challenges we're seeing now to maybe a broader discussion about the implications of this. So, as we have established, the Trump administration has refused to comply with court rulings, which have in turn undermined institutional authority. But this is more than just an erosion of legal institutions. The administration also disregards central democratic norms. So, do you think that we can call the current situation a so-called constitutional crisis? And what does that term actually mean in practice?
Yeah, so I think yes, and I've been saying that for a while. To me, what's a constitutional crisis? It's when the checks and balances, the accountability for the presidency is not working anymore. That is when the Constitution ceases to be a document that guides behavior, that disincentivizes bad behavior meaning actions taken to interfere with people's liberties, people's freedom from being arrested, freedom from being executed for no reason. That's life, liberty, or property, ability to speak freely without retribution. And as we talked about earlier, the checks and balances on the presidency aren't functioning. I did a column in 2022 for Political Magazine after teaching a class, and I asked my students, we put all the checks and balances back then on the president on the board and asked which ones are still functioning, and the conclusion was the only one left to meaningfully slow people down in the White House from bad behavior was an indictment. Mm-hmm. We had multiple indictments. Now that's not possible anymore. Last week, I think it was Monday, the New York Times ran a long piece, interviewed 35 constitutional law experts, including myself, and with maybe one exception, I think the consensus was we're now in a constitutional crisis, which I thought was helpful in that maybe we can shift the discussion from are we there yet to what do we do?
Yeah, and how can such a crisis be resolved? Probably a difficult question, but...
I don't have an answer to that question. I really don't. People are pointing out the fact that there is pushback. There are, AOC and Bernie Sanders is speaking out, and there's rallies, and there's some members of Congress are pushing back. But history tells us those kind of bonfires here and there are not going to turn things around. Mm-hmm. There's the midterms. People are holding on to the midterms. Imagine the entire United States Congress is now Democrat. What are they going to do? Impeach? They have the same tools. Pass laws that John Sauer, Solicitor General, yesterday in the Supreme Court, there was a case relating to birthright citizenship. Obvious violation of the Constitution. 4 federal judges have held that executive order is unconstitutional. And Justice Amy Coney Barrett asked the Solicitor General whether he believes, and I'm paraphrasing, that the U.S. government has to comply with court orders, even at the appellate level, and he said no. He said no. So that's a suggestion that court orders are not an impediment to legal violations. The Supreme Court kind of said the president can violate the law, and we have a United States Congress which is impeaching federal judges for issuing orders that uphold the rule of law. And some federal judges have asked for increased money for their security because there are, we have 400 million guns in the United States. So it's a tinderbox. It's a very intense moment in the United States.
I'm wondering, is there a possibility that it's resolved sort of in the favor of the executive? I'm thinking specifically of the Article 5 Convention of States, which has been an issue rising. What do you
You get birthright citizenship?
No, the idea of the idea of bypassing legislatures, bypassing Congress by state legislatures in changing the Article 5 of the Constitution about amendments.
Well, I think to change that, we would need a constitutional convention, or you'd need to go through, you'd need to go through Congress and a supermajority of the states. But I think the bigger question is, even if you change the Constitution, it has to be enforced. And right now, the First Amendment's not being enforced, the Due Process Clause. I mean, so the Constitution, as I tell my students, it doesn't have its own angels that come down, and just follow people around and make sure the Constitution's enforced. It's only so good. It's a piece of paper. It's only so good as that people are willing to stand up for it. And without the rule of law, the person in the position of power becomes the rule of law.
Yeah.
He decides what is the law, which looks a lot more like a monarchy,
Yeah.
And less like a democracy. And then, if you've got the king being the law based on the king's views on who's good, who's bad, then you have to hope for a benevolent king, not a malevolent king. That's the best you can do. And if you've got a malevolent king, which I think part of the electorate that voted for the current administration did so because they like that boldness. They like the willingness to take a baseball bat and smash all the china in the living room, right, or in the dining room. Like that kind of fierce willingness to blow it up was part of why we are where we are. So I would argue we're not in a position of a benevolent monarch.
Yeah, and this blowing up is not only happening domestically, but the US also saw itself as a defender of the values of liberal democracy, maybe internationally. And in many respects, Trump's upending of legal standards domestically also mirrors his redrawing of the international security landscape. So in what ways would you say is the international community vulnerable here to American developments?
I really appreciate this question because I've been here since February and talked to lots of groups. I'm going to be in Germany next week. I'm doing a series of talks. And I think a question for everyone here is, why do we care about what happens in the United States, right? This is the Netherlands. Why does it matter if the United States democracy fails? Now, I've asked this question of people here as well, and there's a number of answers. One is, it's the oldest written constitution in the world. I think the Dutch one is the second. And it's held up as a model for democracy everywhere else. Like, if that's holding, then there's a beacon or a reason to fight for democracy in other parts of the world where it's fragile. It's fragile everywhere. So if that goes, then people could possibly just give up, and it could have a cascade effect. The second is has to do, of course, NATO and the U.S. military, which is, I think, a source of resentment for some Americans, that a big chunk of our taxpayer dollars don't go towards education, healthcare, housing, things that people here have more access to. They go towards this military. So without that, there's vulnerabilities that maybe a few years ago, Europeans didn't have to think about. And then there's, of course, the economic issue. I'm not an economist. I know you're an economic student, and there's people that know a lot more about this. But if the dollar no longer is kind of the standard currency, the dollar is devalued, it destabilizes the entire globe. And the question is, what becomes the gold standard, the equivalent of the place you put your money and your money is secure? That's been the dollar for decades, in part because it was reliable. There's a U.S. government that's going to, and the Federal Reserve, which is independent of the president, that I think there's an understanding, this gets back to the sort of agreement and the norms, an understanding that the American government will have a sound, rational, coherent, predictable fiscal policy that then the rest of the world can rely on, the dollar becoming a stand-in for some other source of wealth that's secure. So when that starts shifting, we have this aberrant tariff policy, or you just have someone that you don't know what's going to happen, what after breakfast tomorrow, what's going to happen, and that might be different after lunch. That's destabilizing, and it can have economic implications. Of course, we haven't talked about the climate crisis. We're rolling back climate regulation in the United States. Part of the agenda is anti-climate. That's going to affect the rest of the world. We are I think with the US and China, when it comes to artificial intelligence, development of new technologies, this race between two countries, we are in a deregulation mode. So AI is going to affect the lives of everybody on the planet in ways I don't think we can anticipate at all in this moment. Even experts can't anticipate. And I think it's safe to say the discussion around, AI needs to be regulated, at least from the US perspective, that's completely off the table with this administration. It's not going to happen. That's going to affect the rest of the globe. So some would say America's had too much power for too long, and that the moment of American imperialism, the end of that should have come earlier. It's here in some capacity, and so I think all eyes should be caring about what happens.
And so, expanding, so we've talked a lot about American law, but would you think that without the commitment of the US also in the arena of international law and international courts, that we can see how credible is the governance of those principles in this day and age?
Yeah, so I've had that conversation with international law experts here, and it gets back to the same refrain. How do you enforce them? Experts say the U.S. has used sanctions over the years. It's again, there are people that have more expertise. It's not particularly effective. So if the federal government is, at least this particular administration, is not so invested in following U.S. law, I'm not so sure, and some kind of ruling from an international court is going to have any impact whatsoever.
Yeah.
Okay, so I think slowly rounding off this interview, we have now discussed a multitude of challenges facing both the U.S. legal and democratic culture.
Yes, everyone's very depressed. I think that's good.
Yes.
I have that effect on people. Don't shoot the messenger.
We'll try not to. So I was wondering, in facing these challenges, do individuals working within the system, lawyers, politicians, lawmakers, still have the opportunity to confront these issues, or is the system already too weakened to reverse its own collapse?
Well, experts on fascism and tyranny, there are prominent ones, 3 that are leaving Yale University to go to Toronto. They will say it is reversible. That's not necessarily my expertise, but it's going to take bold collective action. And I haven't been in the United States since February, but my sense is we are not there. We are not in a moment where collectively Americans are are waking up to the severity of the threat. There is almost a religiosity in the United States around the Constitution and the ideals, the flag, liberty, justice, equality, we the people, Hamilton, you know, the musical. And so they're coupled with that, I think, is just this belief that American democracy will never die. One of these experts I mentioned at Yale said recently, it's like the Titanic, which was the ship that could never sink. So they didn't have enough lifeboats because it could never sink. Everybody thought it was unsinkable. Yeah. And I do think there's a sense in America that it's unsinkable. That, and then number two is people don't know what to do. And that's terrifying. So you just, like the ostrich, put your head in the sand. That being said, you know, Americans are fierce. When they get their minds on something, they get their minds on something. That's part of the promise of America. We have so much innovation, both in the arts and in technology and development, and so much comes out of the United States. It's so diverse that I don't know if something's ignited where people are realizing, no, I want my freedoms, and it's best for me if everyone has them, that this kind of regime is not good for me. I think there could be something even better on the other side. I just don't know how to get from here to there. President Lincoln is perceived as one of, the greatest presidents of all time. He presided over a rupture, right? At the time of the Civil War, human beings were considered property. So he made a decision at some point to not just keep the Union together and make a deal around slavery, but to end slavery. That was, a rupture. He didn't cause the Civil War, but that was a major rupture that ended in something that we've struggled to maintain, and we've never really quite achieved it, but I think everybody would say it was a good thing. So that's the moment we're in right now, is that rupture. And I hope, as a mother and teacher and someone who cares about these things, that out of the darkness we'll have some light on the other side.
What do you think needs to happen to individuals for them to maybe get across the sense of invincibility of the US legal system?
Yeah, well, if you have ideas on that, let me know. I try to educate. I think step one is education, and educate in a way that people can understand in their own lives. Like the ticket for speeding analogy I use, people get that, right? Yeah. You'll speed if you don't. Once the machine's in the bushes and you're going to get the ticket and your kitchen table and it's annoying, you will slow down the next time you go down that street. It's the ticket that makes you slow down. So education's part of it. Of course, social media and all the misinformation and disinformation makes it extraordinarily difficult. So how you get around that, I really don't know. And it might have to get worse before it gets better. Right now, the assaults on the due process rights have been not expanded to people who not only were born in the United States, but whose parents and grandparents were born in the United States. I don't even know what the definition of a citizen would be with this particular administration, given that the position that being born birthright citizenship shouldn't be valid anymore. Well, I don't know what that turning point is.
Yeah.